America, we need to have a chat. Flahiam, I am humble before you. I am Root. The Druids of ancient times were said to be philosophers and arbiters of dispute, including in what we would call political affairs. Now, just because I identify as a modern Druid doesn't mean I am necessarily good at philosophy or politics, but I do have a philosophy, and I endeavor to learn as much as I can and choose my finest words. I have a set of values that emphasizes the virtues of mercy and humility before the creation of this earth and everything on it. My experiential truth comes from my vision according to those values, and so when I see examples of pride and boastfulness, I cannot be undiscerning. The United States of America loves to plant its flag everywhere and proclaim its greatness. It loves to insist that it is the richest, greatest country that has ever existed. I question the wisdom of that sentiment. Why is it, for example, that the average American's income is not enough to meet the average American's basic needs? Why is the wealth gap widening in its population? Are the have-nots just getting lazy? Does nobody want to work anymore? Statistically, people are working harder and longer than ever before. So what has gone wrong? According to what I have learned, there are parallels I can draw from history to help me understand our current situation. There are many books I've read on the subject, such as The Philosopher's Toolkit, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, The Ecotechnic Future by John Michael Greer, The Wealth of Nature, also by John Michael Greer, The End of Growth by Richard Heinberg, and The Party's Over, also by Richard Heinberg. Suffice it to say that there are systemic problems impacting our society in ways that cannot be solved by just working harder, but rather by collective organizing, transparency, and solidarity. Some communities are taking this work very seriously and are doing very important things to organize and change the systems that we rely on. These efforts are critically important in every town and city because society at large is trending towards catastrophe. Not just one catastrophe, but many interconnected ones. There are 3 waves of catastrophe that I think we must collectively prepare for, and each one will be bigger than the one that preceded it. The 3 waves are, in order, political, economic, and ecological. Let's start with the first wave. The curious realm of political science is all about the behavior of large populations and statistical human behavior in power structures. The study of Western democratic societies has been an academic undertaking since the time of the ancient Greeks, who practiced democracy, albeit an entirely classist and patriarchal one. The Greeks had centuries of democracy, and Plato discerned a certain pattern. The life cycle of democracy was explained in one of the most acclaimed books about politics ever written by Plato, called The Republic. When a democracy has fully ripened, he argued, a would-be tyrant would often seize their moment. He described them as usually of the elite, but has a nature in tune with the time, given over to random pleasures and whims, feasting on plenty of food and sex, and reveling in the attention that their egos crave. They exploit divisions in politics and take over a particularly obedient mob and attack their wealthy peers as corrupt. A traitor to their class, as he described them, and soon, as the tyrant's enemies among the elite are shorn of popular legitimacy under the withering assault by the tyrant and his supporters, the tyrant brings them to heel, and they must appease him or lose their power. All it takes is a bad word from the tyrant, and the elite's former supporters boo them from the podium. Eventually, the tyrant stands alone, promising to cut through the paralysis of democratic incoherence and frustrating systems of compromise. The tyrant rides the backlash of their loyal base against the measures taken by the elite to contain the tyrant's rise to power, and as the loyal mobs thrill the tyrant onwards, the guardrails of their democracy are obliterated, and a totalitarian dynasty is founded. Even if only a minority of the total population supports the tyrant, even if only 10% of that population supports the tyrant, That is enough to throw society at large into chaos. Scapegoats are targeted for demonization, harassment, and eventually violence. The police and the courts must struggle with some within their own ranks who support the tyrant, either willingly or out of fear. These officials enable, or at least turn a blind eye, to corruption and crimes committed on the tyrant's behalf. Seeing an opportunity to rapidly climb the ladder of power, all of the most ambitious, worst actors of society then flock to the tyrant's banner. And by the time the tyrant seizes control of an entire political party, they become very difficult to dislodge. At worst, there is civil war. At best, a disruptive and enduring insurgency. Even in the best case, the rift in society gives opportunity to more corrupt actors seeking to exploit those divisions, and shows those seeking a path to power who to ally with and invest in. Stock prices don't care about the moral fiber of those in power. The numbers must go up. Which brings us to the second wave. Wages have stagnated while the cost of living has gone way up, and as of this recording, the trend continues. There are lots of theories about why, but most economists agree that the underlying reason is because we have a debt-based economy, which fundamentally involves never-ending inflation. It basically goes like this. When a bank makes a loan, it gets the borrower's IOU, promising to pay the money back to the bank with interest. In exchange, the bank creates the bank account entry that the borrower can use as money, and this is the bank's IOU. Thus, when the money is paid back, the IOUs on both sides are extinguished. Money is no longer owed, which in effect means the money no longer exists. Whenever a borrower repays a loan to a bank, that money disappears from the overall money supply. The money supply increases when banks make loans and decreases when borrowers pay principal back to the banks. What this amounts to is that homeowners paying on their mortgages, graduates paying on their student loans, and all the other borrowers are essentially paying the banks to keep the economy inflated with imaginary digital money that is bought and sold by other entities. If you've ever taken a mortgage loan from a bank, you may have received a notice a few months later saying that some other institution has taken over your loan, and so you will now be sending your payments to a different address. What happened is the bank has sold your loan as an investment asset. There are various government-sponsored institutions that do this. They buy multiple loans from banks and package them into investment securities that are then sold to investors. This has an amplifying effect on loans, or debt securities, so debt multiplies while the physical currency supply stays the same. This has a profound effect on the structure and function of the economy. This in turn deeply affects the social structure and the power dynamics of any society trying to live under such an economy. And the result is a predatory relationship between the rich and poor, funneling ever more wealth from the poor to the rich. Through the payment of interest, a constant flow of money and resources moves from the many who can't afford to buy a house, get an education, or run a business without borrowing, to the few who already have vast sums of money, and to corporations that exist solely for the purpose of making profits from this system. In addition to the moral objections to this sort of class structure and undemocratic power hierarchy, it is functionally unsustainable, and it has begun to demonstrate that in more and more devastating ways. The longer it continues, the more it squeezes and crushes the working class, even though it is the working class that is producing the goods and services that the whole system relies on. The inevitable result of this system is revolution, which ties back to the political crisis I mentioned earlier. There is one other aspect to the economic crisis that is more grounded in physical reality than the imaginary world of money, and that is the energy resources that we use to do work. Now, there is a lot of hand-waving about the so-called green tech revolution, but the fact of the matter is that the global economy is deeply and thoroughly dependent on affordable fossil fuels. The energy density of fossil oil is tremendous, and because its use is so pervasive, its true power is largely taken for granted. 1 barrel of oil embodies 25,000 hours of human labor, calorie to calorie. We grew up in a world where if the car runs out of fuel, you put another gallon in and keep going without really thinking about it. Civilization has built our entire lives around wasteful devices that use great quantities of energy, either directly or indirectly. Most dwellings are poorly insulated and are energy intensive to heat or cool. Society is structured based on things like the demand to ship avocados and other foods that do not grow in our local ecosystems, even from the other side of the world, to have every day of the year simply for our pleasure. As supply constricts and fuel prices rise from rapid petrochemical drawdown, this will affect every aspect of our lives. Grain production will decrease from lack of petrochemical fertilizers, without which most existing big ag farms become literal desert. This will affect the feedstock for cattle, pigs, and poultry, creating widespread meat shortages. The entire economic paradigm of global civilization is currently built on just-in-time production for maximized profits. This model is great for shareholder value, but dreadful for food security, and civilization has practically gone all in on this model. Natural gas gives us almost all of our nitrogen that we use for agriculture, from hydroponic systems to corn in the fields. Nitrogen from natural gas is used to grow almost every crop in the world. Phosphorus is another critical nutrient used in agriculture, and it is mined very intensively, most of it coming from mines in Morocco that are then shipped around the world in multitudes of massive cargo ships, and each one of those ships burns 80,000 gallons of gasoline a day. As oil supply eventually becomes unavailable due to being either unaffordable or unattainable, mining operations will shut down, as will the ability to transport all cargo. This will bring a stop also to lithium mines for batteries, which is good because the mining process for lithium destroys entire ecosystems by producing literal lakes of sulfuric acid. Perhaps more importantly, however we source the power, trying to maintain a transportation network based on individual ownership of motor vehicles will lead to a huge disparity in wealth and ultimately wasteful allocation of very limited resources, such as rare earth minerals needed for microchips. Once the natural mineral deposits have been depleted or scarcity of fuel slows production, then the stock numbers cannot go up. The economy collapses, the whole interconnected global economy implodes, management of scarce resources will then, in all likelihood, fall primarily to corrupt actors, the state, and military interests. As well, food security may be a major concern sooner than we expect due to geopolitical conflict, as demonstrated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, disrupting global grain production. There are things we can do to prepare for food insecurity, and it mostly involves localizing our food supply well in advance of real shortages. Many years ago, I studied permaculture for 2 years at the Regenerative Design Institute of California. Permaculture is a design methodology for integrating food, resource management, technologies, and community into a holistic system based on beneficial relationships. It draws heavily from indigenous lifeways, but dresses them up in scientific explanations that are more palatable to Westerners. Permaculture is an excellent tool. They say it is a good place to start, but a horrible place to end. We can keep gardens, use bicycles or horses, solar cookers, solar water heaters, and other appropriate small-scale technologies that allow for a high standard of living without reliance on fuel-hungry and dirty industrial technology. However, what I think is required is not simply technology or increased efficiency, but change driven by philosophical and cultural transformation. I believe we are all doing that work just by building community. We need our circles strong for the third wave, the beginnings of which are increasingly difficult for the world to ignore. Despite all the reassuring pledges by governments and climate change communities, global emissions are set to increase by 16% from 2010 levels by 2030. Vast areas of the planet may see so-called wet bulb heat waves, where high temperatures and humidity combine to create deadly conditions. With 100% humidity, the human body cannot tolerate temperatures hotter than 88 degrees Fahrenheit, even with unlimited shade and water. People cannot work outside in such conditions, meaning that vast areas of the Earth's surface will functionally experience economic collapse for months every year, and this will be in addition to any fuel shortages, food shortages, and frequent storms. Every year, perhaps every month somewhere in the world, there will be devastating heat waves, drought, fire, typhoons, hurricanes, and floods. A word on floods. A warmer climate means that atmosphere will hold more water vapor. For each Celsius degree the atmosphere warms, it holds 7 degrees more water vapor, most of which falls as rain. Hurricanes and atmospheric rivers dump torrents of rain, which form megafloods, like the one that occurred in California a little over 150 years ago. Learning about that historic flood gives us a glimpse of what is to come. The catastrophe began in December 1861, following a drought that had gripped the region for decades. That winter, 15 feet of snow fell in the Sierra Nevada. Repetitive atmospheric rivers dumped warm rain for 43 days straight thereafter, dumping water down the mountain slopes and into the valleys. Some areas had up to 30 feet of water for weeks, obliterating roads, farms, and entire towns. Sacramento, the new state capital at the time, was under 10 feet of mud-choked water for months. 4,000 people lost their lives in that flood. 1/3 of the state's buildings were destroyed, and 1/4 of California's cattle drowned or starved. California's economy was obliterated, resulting in statewide bankruptcy. Climate scientists warn that these kinds of floods will happen again, but will be even more devastating and more frequent. Many of California's major cities are built directly on top of ancient flood deposits. In 1862, only about 500,000 people lived in California. Today, the state's population is nearly 40 million people. Those who will be most affected by these floods will be low-income, working-class people. Additionally, California's Central Valley produces about 1/4 of the nation's food supply. When the next megaflood occurs, food shortages are certain to follow. All of these catastrophes and more will probably cause a massive increase in human migration. Most of the human population lives in coastal areas. These people will lose their homes as coastal areas are swallowed by storms and the rising sea. This, combined with refugees from economic collapse, war, drought, fire, food shortages, and so forth, has the possibility to completely overrun border controls. And no government in the world, no matter how high its walls or how mighty its armies, can stop millions of people desperate to get somewhere. That is just one of the reasons why I think nationalist zealotry is not going to solve anything. And besides, what value is there in peace kept by threat of violence? The tools that will help us most are collective organizing, transparency, and peaceful solidarity. We are all in this together, so let us continue the work, but be sure also to take time to rest and care for yourself. Until next time, you have all my very best wishes for your peace and happiness.
All we do crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see.